Hello, and thank you for joining me again today on the Finding Hope After Loss podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. You can really help the show reach more loss and infertility families by taking a moment to leave a positive review or rating on Apple or Spotify. You can also check out more information about the episode in the show notes at journeyforjasmine.com. In this episode, Ashley, the founder of Bridget's Cradles, shares her story of losing her daughter Bridget at 24 weeks and how that grief became the foundation of a nationwide ministry. Ashley also opens up about stillbirth, faith, and her new book, Cradled in Hope. She speaks directly to lost moms who are navigating grief, doubt, and pain, and she offers encouragement and the reminder that both joy and hope can coexist with sorrow. Hello, everyone. Today I am here with Ashley from Bridget's Cradles. Hi, Ashley. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to have you on and to talk about your new book and everything that you do with Bridget's Cradles.
Yeah,
So, can you start by just, telling a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to start Bridget's Cradles?
yeah. So I live here in Wichita, Kansas with my husband, Matt, and our two boys that are 8 and 4. And we have a daughter in heaven named Bridget, who was stillborn in 2014. So that would be 11 years ago. She is our oldest child and our only girl. And I was 13 weeks pregnant when I started having complications in our pregnancy. Everything in the first trimester seemed pretty normal, and we were just very excited to be growing our family and welcoming a child. We were newly married, and so we were excited that God had blessed us with a child and just excited to become parents and start working on her nursery and all of those things. And I was at work and I started having very heavy bleeding, and I was rushed to the emergency room and found out I had a subchorionic hemorrhage and I had about a 50% chance to miscarry. And so the doctors put me on bed rest and I went home and I was on bed rest for 11 weeks. And I really was just taking it very easy, just laying in bed or on the couch. I went to my high risk doctor appointments, but other than that, I didn't go anywhere. Just tried to do everything that I could to sustain pregnancy and keep my daughter safe. And so we around about a couple weeks before she was actually born, we had gone to some of the doctor's appointments and they were telling us that the hemorrhage was growing larger, and I was ended up being hospitalized in the midst of that because of my bleeding. And the doctors were saying, we don't really think you're going to be staying pregnant much longer given what's going on in your body. And so at that moment, my mom, who is an amazing grandma and also at the time a postpartum nurse, she's since retired, but she wanted to make a tiny little blanket to hold her granddaughter in. And so she started knitting a mint green blanket, like the color of my blankie as a child. And after she made this tiny little blanket, she wondered how she would swaddle such a tiny baby in that blanket. And that's when God gave her the idea to knit the sides up and turn it into a cradle. And so she packed it in her hospital bag. She was hoping and praying that we wouldn't even need the cradle. She actually didn't even tell me that she had made it because she was praying that that would not be the outcome. And when I was 24 weeks, 5 days, I had a placental abruption because the hemorrhage was behind the placenta. And I went into labor. And when I got to the hospital, they had said, you're about to deliver. And shortly thereafter, Bridget was born and she was already in heaven. She did not have a heartbeat and was not breathing. And so even though we knew that was a possible outcome, there was still so much shock and trauma in that moment. And the hospital staff, they placed her in a traditional hospital blanket that you're probably accustomed to seeing in labor and delivery units. But because she was only 13 ounces, she was so tiny. She was perfect. Every little feature of her, she had fingernails and eyelashes. She was very perfectly made, but very, very tiny and fragile. And so she kind of got swallowed up in those big blankets. We couldn't really see her. We couldn't feel her. So my mom placed her in the cradle and we got to hold her for 24 hours in the hospital. Both of our families came and got to hold her, and my husband and I could pick her up and kiss her and just lay her on our chest and just bond with her in the cradle in a very loving and dignified way. And so in the midst of all this sadness and grief and heartbreak, we had this little cradle and we got to enjoy these moments with our daughter and make these memories that we'll remember forever. And we had a photographer come and take pictures of us holding her. So that was how Bridget's life story, but also how the ministry was born, was through this little cradle that the grandma made for her granddaughter and also out of love for me. And shortly after Bridget's birth, the hospital where she was delivered at, they said, we've never seen anything like these cradles. You know, we have second trimester losses and we don't have anything to put them in. And so we are placing babies in medical basins and in washcloths. And they said we would love to have more of these to have a very honoring way for these babies to be held and for the families to be able to bond with their baby in the short amount of time they have. So my mom started making more, and that was really how our nonprofit got started.
Wow, that's such an amazing thing too, because, like you said, so many people who go through that early loss just don't have things like that available to them. I mean, even sometimes with late losses, you don't have those kinds of things available. And I think that is really, really important to those families to know that like their baby is seen as a person too, and not just, well, we don't know what to do.
Yes, absolutely. And something that we really thought about after we had started providing the cradles was a lot of times families don't have any choice of what their baby's going to wear because a lot of times they'll find out there's no heartbeat and then they'll go straight to the hospital or there'll be a medical emergency and then they're hospitalized and they're having their baby. And so there was really, in a lot of situations, there's no time to prepare or to pick something out for your baby to wear or to be held in. And so most families go to the hospital without anything, and then they feel very helpless in this situation that's completely out of control. And so one thing when we tell the hospital staff when we donate cradles is that we really suggest that the nurses bring in a couple of cradles and allow the families to choose which one for their baby. Because in the midst of all this chaos, it's something that they can control. It's something they can pick to honor their baby's life. They can pick the color, the design, and, that's going to be the only thing that touched their baby or held their baby. And many families tell us after the fact that they have either chosen to keep the cradle as a keepsake, and some of them will put it in a shadow box, or even I've heard moms will sleep with it because it's something that held their baby. Or, like in our case, we chose to bury Bridget inside her cradle in the casket. And that was very comforting for us. And that's why we ended up adding a little keepsake to every cradle so that if families do choose to bury their baby in the cradle, they still have a piece of the same cradle made of the same yarn that was physically present with their baby and touched their baby. And that was something they can still hold on to.
Oh, I love that. I love that little addition because, yeah, that would be such a hard decision to make. You want to bury them in something comfortable, but you also, like you said, it's the only thing that touched them, and that's the only thing you'll ever have. So I can see that being a tough decision to make. And I like that you made it where you don't have to really make that decision.
Yeah.
So now do you donate to like hospitals across the US, or is it just,
Yes, so we are now in over 1,600 hospitals in all
oh,
50 states. We donate 30,000 cradles and memory keepsakes a year. I think last year we hit over 250,000 cradles and keepsakes that we had sent from the beginning of our nonprofit, which we celebrated 10 years of being a nonprofit this year. So over 250,000 cradles and memory keepsakes that we have sent out to hospitals across the country. And I mean, those numbers seem very large and overwhelming to think about, but at the end of the day, our ministry really tries to focus on the one family, because we're processing thousands of cradles that are coming in and out of our doors from our volunteers. We have knitters and crocheters all across the country making the cradles and sending them to us, and then we're sewing them and tagging them and adding information about our ministry and the support groups that we have, our podcast and my book, and we have free ebooks for families on how to plan a memorial service. We have ebooks on grieving through the holidays and honoring your baby on their due date and Heaven Day. We have ebooks for people who want to support or love someone through the loss of a baby, like a family member or a friend. So we have all these resources on our website. So we put all of that in this little booklet inside the cradle so that the cradle is there to comfort them in the moment and to hold their baby in the hospital. But once they leave the hospital and they have empty arms and they're going back to an empty nursery, that they have a community of women that are going to support and encourage them. And in our specific case for our nonprofit, we are a Christian nonprofit. And so sharing the hope of heaven that the families can find hope to see their baby again in heaven through Jesus. And we offer a lot of community outreach situations where, you don't have to be alone in your grief. We have Hope Online, which is a community of women that gather online, and I lead that every month. We do in-person support groups as well, and then remembrance events throughout the year, such as Wave of Light. We do a Mother's Day event. Those specific ones are in Wichita, Kansas, but we do the online support groups as well, and then have our podcast called Cradled in Hope, which is the same name as my book. And so we really try to have support resources available once the families leave the hospital. And we have a Facebook group as well for grieving moms, just so that they know they're not alone in this, that they've gone home and they're navigating the hardest, darkest season of their life, and they don't know where to turn and what to do and how they're going to move forward. And just knowing there are other women that are going to hold you up and walk through this with you and grieve with you and remember your baby with you.
I love all the different things you offer because, yeah, definitely after my loss, I feel like I wasn't given any resources or things like that. So I think it's great that, you're providing that already in the hospital so they're not having to go out and search for that information.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about your new book. So what inspired you to write it?
Yeah. So the book is called Cradled in Hope, Trusting Jesus to Heal Your Heart as He Holds Your Baby in Heaven. And it really was and is my story and my heart on paper. I started writing it in 2020, so it took about 5 years to come to completion. The publishing process takes a little while, but through that time, I was leading support groups and writing messages for these support groups. And a lot of those messages that I wrote for the support groups ended up being chapter content in the book. But really, it's sharing my daughter's story and the story of my own grief journey. But really, it's meant to be a biblical guide for grieving with hope throughout miscarriage, stillbirth, and infant loss. And so the book starts kind of with in the midst of the heartbreak and the pain, and then tries to lead you on this journey from heartbreak to hope and pain to purpose. And each chapter, I really go into a lot of the feelings and the emotions that I experienced through my journey. And so the chapter titles, there's the truth or the hope that I'm trying to impart, but also the emotion or the struggle. And so, for example, there's one called When You Are Triggered, or When You Are Filled with Sadness or Overwhelmed with Sadness. There's one about when you are longing for heaven. And so just different aspects of the grief journey that I was trying to really focus in on. But each one, I would say, really starts with a story, a personal connection of my own journey, but then leads into biblical knowledge and truth and theology, but not in a like scholastic kind of way, just in a very practical, here's the hope, and then leads into practical guidance on how to live this out and also just how to walk through grief physically, emotionally, spiritually. And the whole journey really is wanting to point each mom that's reading it to the hope of heaven, that there is hope to see our babies again in heaven. And that has been such a source of comfort for me in my grief, to know that I will get to see Bridget again. And ultimately, just wanting each mama to meet Jesus in the pages of my book and to find hope in the hopelessness that this can often feel so dark and like there's not anything good that will come from it. And that certainly was something that I felt early on in my grief, was how could anything good come from this? And I've seen God use my daughter's life to bring so much beauty into the world and to change my heart and to change me really in the rest of my life because of her. And so even though she never took a single breath on this earth, she changed my life more than anyone besides Jesus. So that's the basics of the book. There's obviously a lot of content in there, a lot of different chapters that focus on very specific aspects of grief. And I would love to answer any questions you have about any of those, but that's the overarching theme, is pointing grieving moms to the hope that they have.
So, do you think the book is more for people who are already religious, or do you think that it can be for people who are struggling with it, or for people who maybe aren't religious at all? Like, who would you say
That's
that it's for?
That is a great question. I'm really glad that you asked that. So I wrote the book for all of the above. And you might be thinking, well, how could it possibly be for all of those three categories? Because those three categories seem like very different categories. And here's how I'll answer that and explain. So for the mom who's very strong in her faith, like I felt like I was at the time when I lost Bridget, this book will hopefully be an encouragement to strengthen her faith and just remind her of the truth. And even if you are a strong believer, something as devastating and traumatic as losing a baby, is there are going to be big questions that you have about God and struggles that you have to wrestle with. And that was certainly my case. And so that brings me to the next group of people, which you said people who are struggling or questioning or doubting. And that's a theme throughout my book, is talking about when you question who God is. That's actually one of the chapters. When you feel abandoned by God, these are very real feelings that I had and I wrestled with. And so if someone is struggling and they're like, I don't even know what I think about God or Jesus or heaven or life after death, and where do babies go when they die, and all of those questions, I try to answer those biblically in the book, but in a way where it's very much expressing the feelings that I had, just from my own being a human walking through trials, that I'm not trying to be some religious, righteous person just preaching to moms. That is not how I wanted to write this book. It is not my heart. It was very much, I want to show you exactly how I felt and how it's natural to feel these things and to question God and to wonder these things, but hopefully just kind of walking you through that and leading moms back to truth. And then for the group of women who are not religious, who don't believe in Jesus, may not have had a relationship with God at all, you might think, well, this book has Jesus on the cover. It has a picture of Jesus on the cover. It says a biblical guide. It talks about trusting Jesus. So why would this book be for them? Here's what I'll say is, I think that if there's even a part of a woman's heart that feels maybe there's something more here, like what happened, with my baby? What do I believe about God? And how am I going to get through this? And certainly there are times in people's lives where it's like some tragedy happens and they end up finding God through it because they're asking those hard questions. I call it a crisis of faith. And I experienced that, where it's like something happens and it kind of places, these questions of what do I actually think about Jesus? What do I believe about these things? And it's an opportunity to ask those questions. I think that even if someone were to read my entire book and not come to that same conclusion that I did, that they would still find comfort and practical guidance throughout the book without feeling like they're being pushed or pressured into anything. I think the book is written in a very gracious, loving way of saying, I see you in this. I'm here to walk with you through this. I'm not trying to push anything. Really, hopefully, anyone that's reading it will feel my heart, that it's just an invitation to explore what it would mean to grieve with hope and have faith. So I know that was a long way to answer that, but I really wrote it for all women grieving the loss of a baby, and specifically with a heart for each of those categories, knowing that any mom could pick this up at any point in her journey, with or without a faith background, or in the midst of a struggle with their faith. And my hope is that it would be comforting and hopeful to every mom that reads it.
And I appreciate that you write it like that because that's definitely something I struggled with as well. I was praying every day that my daughter would, make it, that she would get through, her condition. And then when we lost her, I was so angry and I'm like, what? I mean, what did you want me to do? So that's like, I struggled with that. And so I
Yes.
really relate to that a lot. And I appreciate that you write it from that perspective instead of just as you say, preachy
Yes.
perspective.
Yeah. So I have an entire chapter called Broken and Bleeding When You Feel Abandoned by God. Because, like you, that entire time I was pregnant with Bridget, I was praying that she would be full term and healthy and that God would heal. And so I felt like God had abandoned me. Like, why was He not answering these good prayers, And a lot of feelings of like, am I being punished? Is there some reason that I don't deserve to be a mom? I mean, all these lies that were being planted in my mind. And I do talk about spiritual warfare in the book and about how the enemy wants to use this situation to pull us further away from God. And there was a lot of wrestling. And I hope that if you specifically, Sarah, and any mom who's listening to this podcast, if you have these questions and you're feeling the same way, which I want to say I have so much grace for you because I felt those things and it's a natural response to wonder why God would allow babies to die and why this would be a part of our life story. I think if you're not asking those questions, that would actually be very strange to me because that's a natural part of going through grief and trials. And so I would invite you to take a chance and read these chapters and see the journey that God took me on and figuring out who He is and how I can relate to Him and untrust Him and know that no, He did not abandon me, even though it wasn't the outcome that I desired and that I prayed for. And that's the answer to that is much longer than we have time to go through on the podcast. And even my book, even though I try to really explain all of that, it's hard to do so. But I think the biggest thing for me, the biggest shift was choosing to see God for who He is because of who He is in the Bible and what He says about His character instead of allowing my circumstances to skew my perception of Him. And I have a lot about that in my book, and we don't have to go into all of that right now. But I guess what I would like to say to anyone who's struggling with that is you're not alone in those feelings. And if you are wanting to lean into those and to wrestle, that God welcomes those hard questions and He welcomes your anger. He welcomes you yelling at Him, as I have in the past. He welcomes those emotions because He will show Himself to you. And I do believe that He will show His character and show His faithfulness and His goodness in that. And it's hard to see sometimes in the moment, but throughout my journey, I've seen that. And I hope that I'm imparting that in my book and inviting other moms to see Him for who He is too.
I know another thing that a lot of lost moms struggle with is, family and friends saying those unsupportive things. And, it gets really frustrating to hear those, and it's hard to not be angry sometimes. So, what are your suggestions on how to handle that and how to, give grace to those people when you're very frustrated with those kinds of
Yes.
comments?
Yes. And unfortunately, almost every grieving mom that I've met in every support group has experienced what you're describing. People saying things not intentionally to harm them, but the way that they say them or how they go about it, it feels very insensitive and hurtful. And, there's so many different things that people say and try to kind of I think they're trying to comfort us in some way or have this silver lining in our grief, and a lot of times it does more harm than good. And so I have several things in my book, an entire chapter actually on this topic of when people say hurtful things and throughout the grieving process, how it's common to lose friendships in the midst of grieving a baby and how painful that is and how sometimes it will cause strain in family and friendships and coworkers, neighbors, that aren't supporting you in the way that you thought they would or showing up for you in your grief. And so I do have a section in my book of different remarks that are kind of common for people to say. And then I have a sample response on how to lovingly educate and correct them in a very gracious way, because I do think it's helpful sometimes to educate so that they understand that, hey, when you say at least you can get pregnant again, or at least you have other living children, or at least you were able to get pregnant, those comments are not helpful. Or God needed another angel. I don't believe that babies become angels. I believe that they'll be resurrected humans, that God will resurrect them as humans. And that's actually a very good thing that they're not angels. And also, that theology is not good, and that doesn't help anyone, telling someone that God needed them there instead of here. And so, how do we lovingly correct them without being critical or harsh, but just sharing that, even if I have other living children, I still miss this baby in heaven. Even if I can get pregnant again, which is not even guaranteed, even if I can, that doesn't make me miss this baby any less. I'm going to grieve this baby for the rest of my life, regardless how many other times I can get pregnant or how many living children I have. And so I talk through that, but you mentioned the word grace, and that is something that I talk a lot about in this chapter, because I had so many circumstances in my grieving journey where people would unintentionally say hurtful things, and it would kind of blindside me because even strangers would say things and react to me sharing about Bridget kind of awkwardly. And then that would kind of be hard for me, and it would put me in this emotional tailspin, trigger me, all these things. And so I ended up thinking about it in terms of needing to have this grace cup that I pre-filled with grace and was like, had it ready to go, so that if, as I was going about my life, if someone randomly said something that was hurtful, even if they had good intentions, that I was ready and able to pour that grace out on them instead of living in a state of offense and victimhood, because that was kind of the direction it could have gone if I would continue every time someone says something that it's like, they did this and I'm going to become really bitter about it, and that it would be easy to do that. And so I think seeing people's hearts and seeing, why are they saying this? Are they trying to comfort me? Even though that's not comforting at all, can I see that they were trying to comfort me and see their heart in it and just give them grace, which is much easier said than done. I will say that, but it is helpful for your own heart so that you're not just living in this, like I said, this bitterness or resentment, moving forward toward other people.
Yeah, that's definitely something I struggled with. And I know that I really do believe that most people are not trying to be hurtful, that they just think that it's comforting. But, sometimes it is hard for us to accept that and
Yes,
and we just want to be, like you said, bitter about it, but then that can ruin that relationship. And sometimes it's only hurting us. Like they've moved on, but we're the
right.
ones that are still hurting.
Yeah, and they don't even know that they hurt you, or that what they said could have these different implications. And that's why I do say, like, if you have a close enough relationship with that person to lovingly educate and correct them, not, like I said, in a way where you're doing it without grace, but I think there is a way to share truth with grace where you can say, for example, if they say, at least you already have other living children, you can say, yes, I very much love my living children, but I really miss my daughter in heaven, and I'm going to miss her the rest of my life. And no other future baby will ever be able to replace her. And so, no matter what, my heart is always going to have this place for my daughter. And I think sharing it that way is sharing your heart in that. And then it also tells them, oh, I didn't think about it like that. Yeah, I would miss that baby. And it's very fascinating how people go about things. I think really from the core is that we have a culture that feels very uncomfortable with grief. We don't know how to sit in it with people. We don't know what to say. And so that's why I think a lot of these things kind of come out sideways and awkward, is that we don't know what to say. And so people say the wrong things unintentionally.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. We are definitely not grief literate as a
No,
society at all,
no.
especially when it comes to babies and children.
Yes, yes, I agree.
So I know another thing that you talk about some is the coexistence of both joy and sorrow at the same time, because as you and I both know, after going through loss, there are a lot of conflicting feelings that come at you all at once. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think also in our culture, there's a feeling of, one or the other. And a lot of times we'll use the word but. So we'll say, I am grateful for my living children, but I'm grieving the child in heaven. And so when I started using that language, I was talking to my counselor about it, and she was the one that ended up giving me that term, and I share that in my book. But essentially the idea is you can hold both. It's a and, not a but. And so it's I very much am grateful for my two living boys, and I miss my daughter in heaven. And one doesn't cancel out the other. And so I say, like, a gift doesn't cancel out a grief. And I walked through that journey specifically when I was pregnant and expecting our second son, just walking this journey of grieving Bridget all over again when I realized we were having two boys and I wasn't going to have a daughter on earth. And so I think that kind of opened up the floodgates of missing Bridget even more, and the feelings of shame that I felt over grieving that. And in the midst of a pregnancy, I was talking to my counselor about it, and she was saying, you can hold both, that you can hold this joy and excitement for this new little boy that you're so excited and blessed to have, and also very much grieve your daughter that you didn't get to raise, and that all of those hopes and dreams that you had of raising a daughter, you can also grieve that at the same time. And those feelings can coexist at the same time. And I know that seems like, well, that's pretty simplistic, but I think that is the journey of grief, because as you are grieving, there will be joy that gets brought back into your life, and there are blessings that you have. And at the same time, sadness as an undercurrent in your life. And it's not an all or nothing. It's not, you're not most likely going to be feeling one thing all the time every day. And so to me, it's the dance of life, is just holding both all the time, holding the joy, holding the sorrow, holding the grief, holding the gratitude, all at the same time, and navigating that, knowing that that's welcome and that's normal and it's okay to feel those things, and you don't have to try to shame yourself out of feeling one or the other.
Pregnancy after loss is definitely one of those times that all of those feelings come up, because they did for me too. And I was kind of surprised at the extra grief that kind of came on because of that. Because you think, oh, like I'm pregnant again. I'm gonna be, not that they're a replacement, but you're happy because you're pregnant, and then it's just a lot of sadness that goes along
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of triggers and fears and anxieties from having lost a baby before that you carry into the next pregnancy. And then certainly if you have a baby after loss, all of those milestones that you walk through with your baby. For me, Bridget was our first child, and so we never got to experience any of that with her. But then when we had our oldest son, her younger brother, it was like, well, when he smiled for the first time, it was like, oh, we missed that with Bridget. And so, all these milestones we were walking through our son's babyhood and childhood, reminding us of all the things that we didn't get to experience with Bridget. And so it's definitely a holding both experience.
Do you have, I mean, I know that all of the chapters are based on your experience, but do you have like a chapter that's the most meaningful to you, or like your favorite chapter to write, or
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. It's hard to pick just one, but I would probably say the last one, which is Our Future Forever. So it really kind of culminates to the end, which is talking about forever. And it's a term that I've really been resonating with recently, which is the term homesick, which is feeling like I'm excited for heaven. And that sounds a little pessimistic, I guess. It's not that I'm longing to die, it's that I'm just longing for reunion with my daughter and also with my dad. My dad was killed by a drunk driver last year, and this has been one of the hardest years of my life. And so walking through so much grief and knowing that there's a day that all of that grief will go away and God will wipe away our tears and I'll be with my loved ones forever in heaven. And so the last chapter is just this very hope-filled idea of what is to come. And I talk about it biblically, about what the future forever is going to look like in heaven. And so, yeah, I think it's just like the culmination of the entire book because the beginning of the book really talks about sitting in sadness and lamenting and walking through just trying to survive the initial days of grief and then walking through this foundation of our faith and all these questions that we have. And then as you get into the core of the book, there's chapters on how to forgive yourself, all the questions that we have as moms. Did we do something to cause this to happen? And the chapter that you mentioned about forgiving other people who hurt us. And there's a chapter about being triggered and all the anxieties that we walk through after the loss of a baby, and a chapter about spiritual warfare. And then it kind of goes into how we can let God transform us in our grief. And this is kind of a fancy Christian term, but it's sanctification, like how he changes us in the midst of it. And then goes into how we can use our grief for good and help other people. And so all of that is that journey. But then the final chapter is about heaven and our future forever being finally reunited with our babies. And I think that was the climax of the book because that is the climax of the story is when we finally everything will finally be made right and all of our tears will be wiped away. And I think ultimately as grieving moms, that is our greatest desire is to be with our children again and to have all of our tears wiped away. And so that is how I wanted to end the book was just that, one day all of this will be made right and will be forever home. And so that, I mean, it's hard to pick anyone, but I think that one is the most hope-filled, and that's where I wanted to leave my readers at the very end was focused on where we're headed and the hope that we have to see our babies again through Jesus.
That is something that keeps me going as well, knowing that, someday I will get to see her again. And, that's not saying like I want to like die today and go, but
Right. Yeah,
which I
it's
think some people confuse.
yes, I actually say that in my book that it's not a suicidal kind of thinking to long for heaven. It's not longing for death. It's just longing for, particularly for Jesus to come back and also to know, like, when it is my time, that I will be ready and excited to see Bridget and my dad and loved ones. So it's a weird thing to talk about because I think that people think, oh, you just want to go to heaven. I do want to go to heaven just when it's my time and when in God's sovereignty, he has numbered my days. And so, yeah, it's an interesting thing to talk about, but I think it leaves people with hope because I think we're all feeling this. And if you're listening to this podcast, you have walked through the brokenness of your own body and the brokenness of this world and the brokenness of death. And I think everything that I've been through in my life, I've walked through many, many trials and very, very hard situations that have just brought me to my knees. And I think there is just longing for one day for all of that to expire, the suffering to expire. And that's what I say in my book is there will be a day where the suffering is there, it comes to an end. And all the crying, the mourning, the sadness, the pain will have passed away. Revelation 21:4. And, that's the final book of the Bible. And I talk a lot about that in the final chapter of my book. And so, yeah, that's how I wanted to end the book was just really focus on what's to come, that no matter what we're going through, including the loss of a baby, that there is a beautiful, hope-filled future for us as grieving moms. And it's hard to see that because it feels so final. When you lose a baby, it feels so permanent. Like I'm not going to be with my daughter the rest of my life. That feels so final, but it's not final. It's a temporary separation. I will see her again and you will see Jasmine and your babies again. And I'm so grateful for that hope.
Yeah, it'll be the day that your family gets to finally be, whole. Because it's like
Yes.
we just walk around incomplete.
Yes. That is a perfect word to describe it. Incomplete.
So are there any other words of hope that you want to give the listeners?
Yeah, so I would say if you're walking through fresh grief, or even if it's been months or years and the grief still feels so heavy, which again, I think we shame ourselves into thinking there's some sort of timeline or some sort of formula that we need to follow and be better by a certain point. I mean, I'm actively grieving my dad right now, and it's been over a year. And in some ways, I feel like my grief has gotten worse after a year. And culture makes you feel like you should be better after a year. And so it's complicated to be walking this journey with so many expectations and pressures. And so I would just like to say, you are on your own unique journey with Jesus on this healing journey. And you might not even be believing in Jesus right now. You might be struggling with him and having doubts or questions. And that's okay. That's okay to be at that place. But I would just say keep leaning in, keep having those questions, keep bringing those things. I think it's very helpful when we do bring those to him instead of turning away from him, because in my perspective, and of course this is coming from a biblical perspective, but I came to the conclusion very early on that if I don't have him to turn to, I have no hope. There is no hope to see Bridget again. And I know that sounds very black and white, but that is what I believe, is that through faith in Jesus, I will see her again. And without him, I don't have that hope. And I think even though I have these hard questions and I wonder, why did he let this happen? Why is this part of my life story? I think that with my dad and all these hard questions, I think I've just come to the conclusion like, I want to walk with him. I want to grieve with hope, because grieving without hope is so much worse and so much harder. And ultimately, as I said before, there will be an expiration date and it will get better. And so I use the analogy of a tunnel. Grief is dark no matter if you're a believer or not. It's just hard. I mean, I am a follower of Jesus and I am grieving, and the tunnel for me is dark right now. But I think what I've tried to express in my book is that I know that Jesus is in the tunnel with me, and I know that there's light at the end of the tunnel. And so, I guess what I would want to say to someone who's listening who feels like they're in this tunnel and there's no way out, and the grief is so intense and so heavy and so overwhelming, and you feel like it's just darkness and going to be hopeless for the rest of your life. I just want to say to you that I do believe that Jesus is there in the darkness with you, and that he is going to be the light that gets you out and walks you out of it, and that he has promised eternal light for you in heaven. And that is the ultimate hope, in my opinion. And so I hope that's encouraging. Again, I'm not trying to be preachy by any means. I just believe it in the heart of my hearts. I believe it to be true. I've seen it to be true. And I don't say that just from some stand. I say that from a woman who has literally held my lifeless daughter, and I've watched my dad suffer, and I've been through these incredibly difficult trials, and I've yet in the midst of it seen God's goodness and faithfulness. And it doesn't make sense, but I've seen him there and I've felt his presence, and I've determined that I want to lean on him and I want to grieve with him, and I do put my trust in him. And so I hope that something I've said will be hopeful to someone today, that they would consider him as you grieve.
Yeah, grief definitely is such a lonely and isolating time. And I think we need all the hope and all the support that we can get. And obviously, that is a very big source of hope right there. The hope that,
Yes,
we have him on our side and that we get to see our children again one day.
yes, absolutely.
So, if people were wanting to find out more information about Bridget's Cradles or purchase your book, where would they go for things like that?
Yeah. So we have a website. It's bridgetscradles.com. And we have on there so many resources. We do have information about my book, but the book is sold wherever books are sold. So Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target.com, wherever you want to go. But also, we have those ebooks that I was talking about. Those are free resources on our website. Our podcast is on the website. information about our support groups in person and online. We have worship playlists. We have so many resources on there. If you can just kind of walk around through it, click on different things. There's a lot of different resources for grieving families. Also, information for volunteers and for hospitals that are interested in receiving the cradles. And then I have my own author website, which is ashleyOpliger.com. On there, something that's unique and special about my website is that I have a free Cradled in Hope guided journal, which is a journal that's meant to complement my book. And so essentially, as you're going through the chapters, there's space for you to write and to journal and to process the different questions and scripture that I put in the book. And so that's completely free. It's over a 100-page journal on my website. It's ashleyOpliger.com/journal. You can get that. We're coming out with a printed version here soon as well. But yeah, those are the two main places that you can find everything.
Well, now I have to go check out the website because I feel like there's so much on there that I haven't seen.
Yes, we launched a brand new website when my book came out. And so that's very new. I mean, we had a lot of that on there before, but all the ebooks are new to the new website. The worship playlist, that all of that was new content that we added.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing about your story and about your amazing new book.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for sharing your story with us. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. If you like the show, please leave a positive review or rating on Apple or Spotify. It only takes a moment and really helps the show reach more loss and infertility families. Thank you so much for tuning in, and remember, we are all in this together.